There's a certain kind of feeling that very few games manage to create. It isn't excitement, and it isn't comfort. It's not even really fun in the traditional sense. It's something quieter than that, something heavier, a feeling of standing in a world that doesn't care whether you succeed or fail, and choosing to move forward anyway. Most games are designed to support the player. They guide you and protect you, and they make sure that you're always progressing in some visible way. Even when you fail, there's usually a safety net waiting for you, and you lose a little progress, and maybe restart from a checkpoint, and then you try again, with more information than before. The experience is structured so that you rarely feel completely lost, and even more rarely, feel completely alone. Over time, you begin to trust that structure. You trust that if something goes wrong, the game will give you a way forward. You trust that the challenges you face are meant to be overcome in that exact moment. And most importantly, you trust that if you keep moving in that direction, the game is pointing you, you will eventually succeed. That trust is comforting. It makes games easy to engage with, and easy to understand, and really easy to enjoy without a lot of friction. You don't have to question your decisions very often, because the game is constantly reinforcing that you're doing the right thing. Progress becomes predictable. You move forward, you complete objectives, you receive rewards. And then, you repeat that loop, over and over and over again. The game Elden Ring breaks that expectation almost immediately. The game doesn't support you in the same way the other games do. It doesn't constantly guide you, and it doesn't always reassure you that you're on the right path. Instead, it places you into a world and takes a step back. It allows these things to happen without explanation, without confirmation, and without the kind of structure that most players are used to relying on. And that creates a very different kind of feeling. Because when a game supports you, you feel safe. You feel like you're working with the system, like there's an invisible hand making sure that your experience stays balanced and controlled. But when that support is removed, or even just reduced, you start to feel exposed. You begin to question your decisions in a way that you normally wouldn't. You hesitate before engaging with enemies. You pause before entering new areas. Even simple actions, like walking down a path or opening a door, start to feel like choices instead of automatic steps in a process. That shift might seem small, but it has a massive impact on how the game feels moment to moment. Think about how you approach a typical open-world game. You see a marker on the map, you move towards it, and along the way, you might get distracted by side content. But there's always a sense that you're moving in the correct direction. The game is constantly validating your actions, whether through rewards or progress indicators, and sometimes even narrative cues. Now compare that to the early moments of Elden Ring. You step into Limgrave, and there's no clear path laid out in front of you. There's no immediate objective pulling your attention in one specific direction. The world is open, but it's all uncertain. You can go almost anywhere, but you don't know where you should go, or what you'll find when you get there. And because of that, your mindset changes. You're not just moving forward, you're deciding where forward even is. That decision-making process becomes a core part of the experience. Every direction you choose, every enemy you engage, every area you explore feels like something you initiated, rather than something the game assigned to you. And that creates a sense of ownership that most games don't achieve. But it also creates tension. Because without clear guidance, you don't know if you're making the right decisions. You don't know if you're prepared for what's ahead, and you don't know how costly a mistake might be. That uncertainty is what gives Elden Ring its weight. It's not just about difficulty, and it's not just about mechanics. It's about the emotional state the game puts you in while you're playing. A state where you're alert, cautious, and constantly evaluating your surroundings, because the game is not doing that work for you. And over time, something interesting begins to happen. You start to adapt to that uncertainty. At first, it feels uncomfortable. You might feel lost, or unsure, or even frustrated by the lack of direction. But as you continue to play, you begin to develop your own sense of structure. You start to recognize patterns in the world, and you learn how enemies behave. You begin to understand how far you can push yourself before things become too dangerous. And slowly, that initial discomfort turns into confidence. Not the kind of confidence that comes from the game telling you that you're doing well, but the kind that comes from experience, from making decisions, seeing those results, and adjusting your approach based on what you've learned. The transformation is very subtle, but it is incredibly important, because it means that the game isn't just testing your ability to follow instructions, it's teaching you how to think differently. Instead of reacting to clearly defined objectives, you're interpreting situations. Instead of relying on the game to guide you, you're building your own understanding of how the world works. And that process of uncertainty, decision-making, failure, and adaptation is what gives Elden Ring its distinct identity. It's not trying to make you feel powerful right away. It's not trying to make you feel comfortable. It's trying to place you in a world that exists independently of you, and then let you figure out how to exist within it. And once you start to understand that, everything else begins to make more sense. Because every system in the game, from combat to exploration to progression, is built to reinforce that same idea. That you are not being carried through the experience. You are navigating it. And that difference is what makes Elden Ring feel the way it does. To understand why Elden Ring feels so different, you first have to understand what most games are trying to do. Over the past decade, game design has moved steadily toward accessibility and clarity. The goal has been to make experiences easier to understand, and easier to navigate, and easier to complete without unnecessary friction. This shift shows up in a lot of different ways. Objectives are clearly marked on the map, often with multiple layers of guidance pointing you in the same direction. Systems are introduced early and explained directly, so the player doesn't have to figure things out through trial and error. Progress is tracked and displayed in ways that make it immediately obvious whether you're moving forward or falling behind. And from a design perspective, this makes a lot of sense. When players understand what they're supposed to do, they're less likely to feel frustrated. When they always have a clear objective, they're less likely to get stuck. And when the game consistently rewards them for their actions, they're more likely to stay engaged over long periods of time. In other words, modern design is built to reduce uncertainty. And for many players, that's a good thing. It lowers the barrier to entry. It allows people to jump into a game without needing a deep understanding of its systems. It creates a smoother, more predictable experience where progress feels consistent and controlled. But that predictability comes at a cost, because when uncertainty is removed, something else disappears with it. the feeling of genuine discovery. If you already know where to go, then reaching that location isn't really exploration, it's just execution. If you already understand how a system works, then using it isn't really learning, it's application. The experience becomes less about figuring things out and more about following a path that has already been laid out for you. Over time, this changes the way players think. You begin to assume that the game will always guide you correctly. You trust that if something is placed in front of you, it's meant to be interacted with immediately. You expect that if there is a challenge, it has been tuned specifically for your current level of ability. And most of the time, that assumption is correct. Games are often designed so that players encounter content in a specific order, with difficulties scaling gradually to match their progression. You're rarely placed in situations where you're completely unprepared, and if you are, the game usually gives you tools or information to compensate. This creates a kind of invisible structure that the player learns to rely on. Even in open-world games, where freedom is emphasized, that structure is still there. The map might be large, but it's often filled with markers that guide your attention. The world might be explorable, but the most important content is usually highlighted in some way. You're free to move around, but you're never truly free without direction. And because of that, the experience starts to feel safe. Not safe in the sense that there's no challenge, but safe in the sense that you're never completely on your own. The game is always there, quietly steering you, making sure that you don't stray too far from the intended experience. Elden Ring removes much of that structure. It doesn't eliminate guidance entirely, but it reduces it to the point where it's no longer the primary way you interact with the game. Instead of being told exactly what to do, you're given space to decide for yourself. And that decision-making process introduces uncertainty back into the experience. You're no longer sure if you're gonna go in the right direction. You're no longer sure if the challenge in front of you is appropriate for your current level. You're no longer sure if the time you spend in a particular area will lead to a meaningful reward. At first, that can feel uncomfortable. Without clear objectives, it's easy to feel like you're not making progress. Without consistent rewards, it's easy to question whether your actions are worthwhile. And without explicit guidance, it's easy to feel lost in a way that most modern games actively try to prevent. But that discomfort serves as a purpose, because it forces you to engage with that game in a different way. Instead of relying on the game to tell you what matters, you have to decide that for yourself. Instead of following a predefined path, you have to create your own. And instead of measuring progress through external indicators, you begin to measure it through your own understanding of the world. That shift from guided experience to self-directed exploration is what makes Elden Ring feel so distinct. It's not just that the game is harder or less forgiving. It's that it asks something different from the player. It asks you to be more attentive, more patient, and more willing to operate without complete information. And in doing so, it creates an experience that feels less like completing a series of tasks, and more like navigating a world that doesn't revolve around you. Uncertainty in Elden Ring isn't just an abstract idea. It's something the game builds directly into how its system functions moment to moment. You can see it clearly when you start looking at how the world is structured, and how enemies are placed, and how the game handles progression without ever fully explaining it. When you first step into Limgrave, one of the first things you notice isn't just the openness of the world. It's the lack of immediate clarity about what matters. There are multiple directions you can take, and none of them are framed as the correct one. There's a ruined church nearby, a forest off to the side, a road leading forward, and enemies scattered in ways that don't immediately tell you what you should engage with and what you should avoid. That lack of clarity forces you to start making decisions very quickly. If you follow the main road, you eventually come across a group of soldiers guarding a gate. On the surface, it looks like a standard encounter, something you're meant to fight through. But if you approach it too aggressively, you'll quickly realize that you can be overwhelmed. There are multiple enemies, ranged attacks coming from behind, and limited space to maneuver. Nothing about this encounter is explained to you. The game doesn't tell you to pull enemies one at a time, or to approach them from a different angle, or to avoid the area entirely and come back later. It simply presents the situation and lets you interpret it. And that's where the system starts to reveal itself. You might try to fight everything at once and fail. You might start to notice that enemies can be separated if you move carefully. And you might realize that stealth is an option, even though the game hasn't explicitly introduced it as a core mechanic. Or you might decide that the risk isn't worth it yet, and move away entirely. All of those outcomes come from the same situation, but the path you take depends entirely on how you read it. Another example of this shows up in how the game handles dungeons and side areas. Early on, you might come across something like the Groveside Cave. It's not highlighted in a dramatic way, and there's no major indication of what's inside. It's just there, slightly off the main path, easy to miss if you're not paying attention. If you decide to enter, you're immediately placed into a different kind of environment. It's darker, more enclosed, and filled with enemies that behave differently from the ones outside. Wolves move quickly, they attack in groups, and create pressure in a way that forces you to react differently than you would in an open space. Again, the game doesn't explain any of this. It doesn't tell you how to handle multiple fast enemies in a confined area. It doesn't warn you about what's deeper inside. It simply changes the condition and lets you figure it out. And that adaptation is where the learning happens. You might realize that positioning matters more in tight spaces. You might start to pay attention to how enemies group up together. And you might learn to slow down, to avoid pulling too many enemies at once, or to use the environment to your advantage. None of these lessons are delivered directly. They come from interaction. The same idea applies to how the game handles progression. In most games, progression is clearly defined. You complete objectives, gain experience, level up, and move forward along a path that's been structured for you. In Elden Ring, that structure is much less visible. You gain runes from defeating enemies, but the game doesn't tell you how much is enough or when you should return to level up. You can carry a large amount of runes for a long time, risking everything, or you can play more cautiously and spend them frequently. There's no clear, correct approach. That decision becomes a part of the player experience. Do you keep pushing forward with a large amount of runes, knowing that a mistake could cost you everything? Or do you retreat, secure what you've gained, and move more slowly through the world? That tension between risk and safety is something you manage constantly. And it's not just tied to combat or exploration. It's built into the core loop of the game. Even the placement of sites of grace contribute to this system. They're not always positioned at predictable intervals. Sometimes they appear just when you need them, and sometimes they're spaced in a way that forces you to push further than you are comfortable with. That unpredictability reinforces the same idea over and over again. You are not operating with complete information, and because of that, every decision matters more. You're not just following a path. You're choosing how to move through a system that doesn't fully reveal itself. You're constantly balancing what you know against what you don't, and adjusting your approach based on what happens next. This is what makes uncertainty feel like a system rather than just a feeling. It's consistent. It shows up in exploration, in combat, in progression, and in the way the world communicates with you. It's not something that happens occasionally. It's something you engage with constantly. And over time, as you begin to understand how these systems work, your relationship with that uncertainty changes. It doesn't go away, but it becomes something you can navigate. You start to recognize when a situation is too risky, when an area is worth exploring, and when it's better to retreat, even when it's worth pushing forward. You develop a sense of judgment that isn't given to you by the game. It's built through experience. And that's where Elden Ring separates itself from more traditional design. It doesn't remove uncertainty as your progress. It teaches you how to live with it. One of the clearest examples of Elden Ring's design philosophy appears almost immediately after you enter Limgrave. As you step out into the open world and begin to move forward, you encounter the Tree Sentinel, a heavily armored knight patrolling on horseback, placed directly along a path that many players naturally follow. At that point in the game, your character is extremely limited. You have basic equipment, minimal health, and only a surface-level understanding of how combat works. And yet, the Tree Sentinel is presented to you without any restrictions. There's no barrier preventing you from engaging with it, and more importantly, there's no warning suggesting that you shouldn't. Most games would handle this differently. If an enemy is significantly stronger than the player, it's usually placed behind some form of progression gate. You might need a certain level, a specific item, or completion of earlier content before you're expected to face it. Or at the very least, the game would signal the danger more explicitly, making it clear that this is something to come back to later. And Elden Ring doesn't do that at all. The Tree Sentinel is visible, it's immediate, and entirely optional. But the game doesn't tell you that it's optional. It simply exists in the world, and the decision to engage with it is left entirely to you. For many players, the first instinct is to fight. You approach, you lock on, and within moments you realize how unprepared you are. The Tree Sentinel's attacks are fast, wide-reaching, and deal a significant amount of damage. It punishes you for hesitation, but it also punishes overconfidence. Trying to trade hits rarely works, and panic rolling often leads directly into another attack. The result is usually the same. You die quickly. Not through dialogue or instruction, but through the experience itself. It's shown you that not everything in this world is meant to be overcome immediately. If you return to the fight right away, you might last a little longer the second time. You might start to recognize some of the attack patterns. The wind-up before a swing, the delay before a follow-up strike. You might realize that staying too close is dangerous, but staying too far invites range pressure. But even with that growing understanding, the fight still feels overwhelming. So you're faced with a choice. You can continue attempting to fight, slowly improving with each attempt, or you can decide to leave and come back later, and that decision is entirely yours. The game doesn't push you in either direction, and it doesn't reward you for persistence in that moment, and it doesn't penalize you for walking away. That freedom is important because it reinforces a core idea. Progression in Elden Ring is not linear. You are not expected to overcome every obstacle the moment you encounter it, but instead, you're expected to evaluate situations, to recognize when something is beyond your current ability, and to adjust your approach accordingly. If you choose to leave the Tree Sentinel and explore elsewhere, you'll start to gain strength. You'll find better equipment, level up your character, and improve your understanding of the combat system. And eventually, when you return, the fight feels different. Maybe not easy, but manageable. The attacks that once felt overwhelming now feel readable. The timing becomes clearer. Your positioning improves. You begin to see openings that weren't obvious before, and you're able to take advantage of them in a way that wasn't possible earlier. And when you finally defeat the Tree Sentinel, the reward feels earned in a very specific way. It's not just that your character is stronger, it's that you understand the system better. You've learned how the game expects you to approach difficult encounters. You've learned that observation matters more than aggression, that patience is often more valuable than speed, and that sometimes the best decision is to step away and come back later. All of that comes from a single encounter. And what makes it so effective is that none of it is explained directly. The game doesn't tell you to come back later, it doesn't tell you how to approach the fight, it doesn't outline the lesson in clear terms. It simply creates a situation where those lessons can be discovered. And this is what makes the Tree Sentinel such an important moment in the early game. It's not just a difficult enemy. It's a demonstration of how Elden Ring expects you to engage with the world. It sets the tone for everything that comes after. From that point forward, you start to approach the game differently. You begin to question whether you're ready for certain encounters. You pay closer attention to enemy behavior. You think more carefully about when to push forward and when to take a step back. And that shift in mindset is exactly what the game is designed to create. Because once you understand that you don't have to fight everything immediately, and that learning is just as important as winning, the entire experience opens up. You're no longer reacting blindly. You're making informed decisions, and that's when the game starts to click. One of the biggest differences in how Elden Ring feels comes from how it treats failure. In most games, failure is something that interrupts your progress. You make a mistake, you're set back, and then you try again, with the goal of avoiding that same mistake. The system is built to keep you moving forward, as smoothly as possible, even when things go wrong. Elden Ring doesn't remove that setback, but it changes what failure means with the experience. Instead of simply acting as a punishment, failure becomes a form of feedback, and that feedback is often very specific, even if the game never explains it directly. You can see this most clearly in combat. Take a standard early encounter, something like the soldiers at Gatefront Ruins. At first, it's easy to treat the situation like a typical fight. You move in, attack one enemy, and then suddenly you're surrounded. Attacks come from multiple directions. Your stamina runs out, and before you have time to recover, you're overwhelmed. The immediate reaction is often frustrating. It feels chaotic, like too much is happening at once. But if you approach that same situation again with a bit more attention, you start to notice what actually went wrong. You pulled too many enemies at once, and you didn't account for the archer positioned behind the group. You committed to attacks without leaving stamina to defend yourself. And none of that is explained to you. But it's all there. And the next time you approach, you have options. You can move more slowly, drawing enemies one at a time, You can take out the ranged threat first. You can disengage earlier instead of committing fully to a fight you're not in control of. The encounter hasn't changed, but your understanding of it has. That pattern repeats throughout the entire game. Boss fights are where it becomes even more apparent. When you face something like Margit for the first time, the fight can feel overwhelming. His attack patterns are irregular, with delayed swings that punish early reactions and sudden follow-ups that catch you off guard. If you treat that fight purely as a test of reflexes, it feels inconsistent and even unfair. But after a few attempts, you start to see the structure underneath it. You notice the timing of his delays. You recognize when an attack chain is actually finished, and you begin to understand which openings are safe and which ones are traps. Each failure adds a small piece of information. Not in a way that the game spells out for you, but in a way that you are experiencing directly. And over time, those pieces come together into something usable. The fight doesn't become easier because the game changes. It becomes easier because you've learned how to read it. This is where Elden Ring's approach to failure becomes distinct. It doesn't try to smooth over mistakes or reduce their impact. If you lose a large amount of runes, that loss is real. If you misjudge a situation, the consequences can set you back significantly. But in exchange for that, the game gives you something more valuable: clarity. Every mistake has a cause, and if you're paying attention, that cause can be understood. Even outside of combat, this idea continues to show up. If you fall while exploring, it's often because you misjudged distance or didn't notice a safe path. If you get caught in a dangerous area, it usually is because you pushed further than you were ready for. If you lost runes on the way back to retrieve them, it's often because you rushed instead of approaching carefully. These aren't random outcomes. They're the result of decisions. And because of that, they can be adjusted. And this is what turns failure into a system rather than just a setback. It creates a loop where each attempt builds on the last. You're not just retrying the same situation. You're approaching it with more understanding each time. And that makes progress feel different. When you finally succeed, it doesn't feel like you got lucky. It feels like you solved something. And that feeling carries more weight than a typical reward, because it's tied directly to your own improvement. The game didn't lower the difficulty. It didn't give you extra assistance. It simply gave you the opportunity to learn. And you took it. That's why failure in Elden Ring doesn't feel empty. Even when it's frustrating, even when it sets you back, it still feels connected to the experience in a meaningful way. It's part of how the game communicates, part of how it teaches, and part of how it builds that sense of progression over time. And once you start to see failure in that way, your approach to the game changes. You become less focused on avoiding mistakes entirely, and more focused on understanding them. You start to expect failure as part of the process, rather than something that interrupts it. And when that shift happens, everything becomes more consistent. The game doesn't feel random anymore. It doesn't feel unfair. It feels structured, just not in a way that immediately is obvious. And that structure is what allows the entire system to work. Because at its core, Elden Ring isn't trying to prevent you from failing. It's trying to make sure that when you do, it means something.